Can y'all hear me all right? I can't hardly hear y'all.
No, you're doing good, Bobby.
Hey, I hear you now. How's that?
You sound good.
Yeah, I got to talking and got to record it. Well, let's see. There's Lawrence. He's the one he's taking it for credit, so he has to have it. So, but he's already made notes anyway. And you, Lawrence, stick that thumb up. Okay, we're talking about those things in reference to homosexuality. I was going to read what Brother Ferguson, he mentions homosexuality about 3 times in his book, doesn't mention a lot of stuff about it. But he also has mentioned some of the passages that we talked about. And he says the numerous words in the Greek language for sexual relationships suggest a preoccupation with this aspect of life. He says also homosexuality was a common result in Greek society, which we understand that, which considered the noblest form of love to be the friendship between men. Some of the greatest names in Greek philosophy regarded it as not inferior to heterosexual love, but it was practiced primarily among males between the early teens and early 20s. All kinds of immoralities were associated with the gods. Not only was prostitution a recognized institution, but through the influence of fertility cults of Asia Minor, Syria, and Phoenicia, it became a part of the religious rites at certain temples. Thus, there were 1,000 sacred prostitutes at the temple of Aphrodite at Corinth. Now, we read from 1 Corinthians a while ago. He says also Dio is the only Gentile author known to have attacked brothels on a moral ground. He goes on page 76 in the book, and he says a man can be prosecuted by another man, however, for a liaison with an unmarried girl unless she was a registered prostitute or a recognized concubine, watch this now, or a widow, or for homosexuality. The law probably did not improve morals, although it did increase blackmail. Then page 232, that's right where my book tears up, 232. Says, let me see down through here. He's talking about magic, and he says, among the many charms that had to do with affairs of love is the following incantations for the 2nd century to the Aphrodite to kindle love in a certain Ammonius, son of Helen of Serapis, son of a slave woman. And so he's just simply talking about that of love there. Okay, let me get my books back the way they were. Okay. So, in the modern discussions of moral standards, we've talked about children and education and so forth, and we also, let me just make a notation here for the people that we talked about children and education, and also we talked about low birth rate and infanticide, and also contraception and abortion, and now we're talking about sexual deviance, talking about homosexuality. And so in modern discussion of a moral standard, a popular argument is that when it comes to sex, nothing is abnormal or deviant. They would say whatever consistent adult wish to do with or to one another is acceptable. Such an attitude is certainly not biblical. The Old Testament sets out specific rules governing even some of the more exotic varieties of sexual behavior. Now go back, we read from Leviticus 18, chapter 20, verse 13, but we want to go back and read some more of the context in reference to that in Leviticus chapter 20, beginning in verse 10. We read verse 13, 20 verse 10, and we read down to verse 13 a while ago. And he begins in verse 10, and he says, and the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. You know, if that was true today, then we wouldn't have all the problems we would have, and that's sad to say, isn't it? But the man that lieth with his father's wife hath uncovered her his father's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. And if a man lie with his daughter-in-law, both of them shall surely be put to death. They have wrought confusion. Their blood shall be upon them. Now, see, he says this relationship, all these different relationships. Then he says, if a man also lie with mankind as life with a woman, both of them shall have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. And if a man take a wife and her mother, it is wickedness. They shall be burned with fire, both he and they, that there be no wickedness among you. And if a man lie with a beast, he shall surely be put to death, and he shall slay the beast. And if a woman approach unto his any beast, and lie down thereto, thou shalt kill the woman and the beast. They shall surely be put to death, and their blood shall be upon them. So he shows all about these different relationships and how gross they may be, but he points that out. In Deuteronomy chapter 22, down in verse 5, he says this. He says, a woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man. So that means women can't wear pants. Neither shall a man put on a woman's garment. That means a man can't wear a kilt. For all that they do so are abomination unto the Lord thy God. See, now I was just kidding about what I said. That's the years ago people would use that verse, a woman shall not wear that which pertaineth unto a man. In other words, she should not wear pants. You remember back in the 70s, that's when the pantsuits came out basically for women, and they were dress pantsuits. And boy, people were, preachers were preaching like everything. And yet they were actually more modest than some of the dresses that women will wear today. I had one woman where I was preaching in Nashville, Alabama. She had one of those stores, and had high stuff, put up on the high shelf, and she was a small lady, so she had a ladder. Well, when she climbed up the ladder, somebody could look up her dress. And so she wore pantsuits, and she would come to Bible study on Wednesday night. And she asked me about them, and I said, well, let me study about them. I'll go back and restudy. And so I went and told her later, I said, to me, it seems like they're more modest. I mean, you're more modest wearing a pantsuit than you are your dress. And years earlier, before, I'm trying to make sure this is before I was a Christian. Well, I was a Christian, but it's before I went to Mexico to preaching. We had a secretary at the furniture store that I worked at, and I worked at a furniture store that done about $400,000 a year. We sold that much, and it wasn't many of us, but 4 or 5 of us in the office and 2 delivery men. And she would wear those short things between, about from her waist to her thigh, about halfway. And so I heard her one day fussing this fellow out. And she said, so I asked later, so what happened? And she said, when they was walking up the stairs, we had a floor down in the basement, the main floor, then upstairs. We had an elevator, but the elevator was tore up. And so they had to walk up. And she was secretary. She wasn't supposed to be showing furniture anyway, but she did. And they were walking up, and that man, he let her walk about 3 steps ahead of him. And boy, she turned around and she flew into him. But she was wrong because of the clothing that she was wearing. So, but this is the passage that people use, and it's, you're not supposed to wear clothing in reference to that. But the idea is they were very strict in reference to that. There's not much difference, which we've already seen, in reference to the clothing of that of men and women in that of the Bible. Then we would find, if you turn to Matthew chapter 5, that Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount said this in Matthew 5, verse 27, 28. He says, you have heard that have been said to them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, he goes on. In other words, we're not supposed to be gazing in reference to that of women. And surely we can look at women. There's a beauty in reference to saying that she's, that's a pretty beautiful woman or whatever. The idea is that a person is looking upon her in reference to a sexual relationship, and that's wrong. And it's the same thing is wrong in reference to a woman looking upon a man in the very same way. And that's what Jesus is trying to get across. And so the Old Testament sets forth out these specific rules govern each one of more exotic varieties of sexual behavior. And Jesus raised that standard even higher when he said that whoever thinks of doing such things is as guilty as if it hadn't been done. In other words, here looking upon a woman and thinking the reference to having a sexual relationship with her, he says that's worse. That's all that you haven't done it, but it's as if you've already done it within because you've done it in your heart. And so again, like I said, I was preaching sermons on the heart. We have to keep our hearts, not pumper hearts, period. So lacking this religious base for moral decisions, the Romans could justify virtually anything they wanted to do for the novelty of it for no other reason. On the basis of what we've seen thus far of their behavior, Paul's description of Roman morale or morals doesn't seem too far off the mark. When he makes that point, their women's exchange, this is not the King James. He says in the book, I think he uses the RSV. He says, their women exchange natural intercourse for unnatural, and the same also the men, giving up their natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. They were filled with envy, every kind of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossipers. They gossip, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious toward parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. That's what he said about them. So when we stop and we think about that, in reference to how bad they were, and again, we have to stop, look at it. He mentions the Romans, but again, just stop for a moment and think that he talks about the Romans, the Gentiles and the Jews, but yet they're Christians. And he talks about them, if you remember, if you go on over to Romans chapter 6, they obeyed the gospel because they had obeyed the form of doctrine that had been delivered unto them. They had truly repented of those things, and they were serving that of God. And the Corinthians, if you recall, they did the very same thing. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 9 through 11. So the unnatural relations which Paul denounces were obvious homosexual, a form of personal interaction with which the church historically has never been comfortable. The Greeks had exalted male homosexuality as the most meaningful form of personal relationship because women were too uneducated to form an intellectual bond with a man. Now, that's what they would say. That's what they believe. And yet, on the other hand, some women left to themselves at home and denied any active participation in Greek society resorted to that of lesbianism as an outlet for their own emotions. Even the writings of the poetess Sappho, 600 BC, praising the beauty of the female students in her school became popular among some groups of women. So by the time the Romans began to imitate in that of the Greek culture in the 2nd century BC, homosexuality had become a part, really an accepted part of the Hellenic life for centuries. Now stop for a moment and think, because again, we want to make sure, because we've tried to understand the diaspora or the Hellenistic Jew and so forth, that during the dispersion of that of the people, they were scattered, the Jewish people were scattered all over, Ezra, Nehemiah, all over the world, that was the kind of influence that was upon that of the Jewish people also. So when Paul condemns them in Romans chapter 1 and even in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we would probably think about that of the Gentile people, but that's not always the case because, again, the Jewish people lived in that Greek culture, and therefore they were involved in those types of things also. So the elite brigade of the Spartans' army was the lovers, men who were required to join in pairs on the theory that no man would turn in battle and disgrace himself in front of his lover. And so Thebes had a simpler core also. The Athenian tyrant, Hipparchus, 190 to 120 BC, had been murdered by two men with whom he was involved in a romantic triangle. Now, we thought that type of thing came out years later, but that's not so. His murderers became national heroes. So Phocas, I think, as you say his name, born 496 BC, and Socrates, 470 to 399 BC, and other leading intellectuals of Greece had male lovers even when they were quite elderly. It was an ungodly world. The Roman world was really an ungodly world. the Romans began to engage in homosexuality as something of a fad, but they were never as comfortable with the practice as the Greeks were. Even though it remained slightly scandalous behavior, it was widely less openly practiced among both sexes by the Romans. Juvenal's bitter second satire is devoted entirely to the denunciation of male homosexuality. And even Martial and other sources made it clear that women also took lovers from their own gender. And so we're not just talking about man and men, but we're talking about women and women. And so imperial leadership was sometimes an incentive to homosexual behavior. Nero, and he was a tyrant, great persecution under him. He engaged in numerous liaisons. I can't say the word. In other words, gatherings with persons of both genders. The Emperor Hadrian, though married, preferred the company of his male lover, Antonius, whose ultimately death he commemorated in a poem. And those who sought to advance their own careers by flattering the emperor were more likely to adapt their morals to his, according to what Martial would say. So it's clear from the artwork, if you have had opportunity to, again, to take the class, some of you may have taken that class, or already taken the class on archaeology, in Pompeii and from other literary references that the Romans regularly engaged in sexual activity, generally considered immoral in our day. They have stones and things like that, drawings of that. Writers like Petronius, 27 to 66 AD, and Martial are quite explicit in describing the sexual behavior of their times, and we cannot entirely dismiss their accounts as mere literary conventions. Sexual aggression played a large part in Roman humor. What is lacking is a sense of shame. And so these are merely diversions for a jaded and amoral society with which differ fundamentally from ours in its attitude towards sexuality. But yet we are seeing that great change that's taking place in our lifetime, in our world now. And so this is a society to which the early church had to proclaim the teachings of Jesus, and how strange his words must have sounded. Ye have heard that it was said, ye cannot commit adultery. But I say unto you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust already committeth adultery with her in his heart. Matthew 5, 27, 28. And then there's Paul that gives that description in Romans 1, 26 and 29 of the degrading passions and every kind of wickedness among that of the Romans. Hits right at the very mark once we see from their own records what they were like in that era. But yet again, when we stop and we see that our own country, the morals of the degrading morals, even in our own country. Any thoughts or comments? Nobody? No comment? Okay, personal grooming. In other words, did these people take a bath? Did they ever clean up? Well, it's really something when you go back and we see these people. They weren't really, I guess, in many ways concerned. They had to open, the open baths. We'll talk about that of the baths, the public baths, and where they just go out and take a bath. But you remember, if you remember seeing any of the movies about the Greeks and all the things that that took place among them, they had all that heavy equipment on, and they weren't all that good. My understanding is that the men were not all that good about cleaning themselves up, and so they had the public baths. But their devotion to the pleasures of the flesh prompted the Greeks and Romans to give more attention to personal grooming and hygiene than any society until modern times. Now, we say that. The Greeks bathed frequently, the Romans obsessively. Cosmetics and dyes and ointments and other beauty aids played an important part in the Greco-Roman life and in the economy. They were also significant for the Jews. The Talmud has a great deal to say about the use of such things. Even the archaeologists have discovered that even the zealots who fled from Jerusalem in 87 and took refuge in the fortress of Masada, carried combs and perfumes and mirrors and equipment for applying makeup with them. And so they did go about doing the things that they did. Now, before we look at what Mr. Bell says, Brother Ferguson points out to us some things in his book that I thought was interesting because he talks about the gymnasium and he talks about baths. He says, with these structures, we turn from spectator to a participatory entertainment. The gymnasium was characteristics of the Jews' world and the baths of the Roman world. But under the empire, hybrid or combination structures developed as the harbor bath gymnasium at Ephesus built under Domitian. In other words, they put the gymnasium and the bath together. And so that the gymnasium had swimming pools and the baths had exercise facilities. Both were general cultures and social societies and did not have any athletic or recreation function. Both were primary for citizens, or the at least moderately well-to-do. Some gymnasiums included an extensive complex. The main feature was a running ground with accompanying facilities. Usually there was also a courtyard covered with sand and surrounded by porticos and rooms, and this was the Palistria, or the sports ground for wrestling. The rooms in the gymnasium complex included bathing rooms, dressing rooms, and storage rooms. And there could also be a lecture hall, for the gymnasium was the center of the activities of the Ephebus. Let's see, I lost my place. Since athletics were under the patronage of the Hermes and the Hercules, especially statues, altars, and cult emblems to them were regularly present. Now, baths ranged from small private establishments to the huge public complexes built by Caracalla and Diocletian in the 3rd century in Rome. So every town seemed to have one or more bathing establishment, the erection of which was a favorite form of public benefaction. Essential were the pools for bathing, usually several for different temperatures of water. The usual order was a warm water pool, hot bath, water again, and finally a cold plunge. So the Romans were skilled in constructing furnaces and hypocastor, that is underground ducts with hot air fumes for controlling the heat in the water, and hot rooms. Some baths were able to take advantage of natural hot mineral springs, as the bath in England and Hierapolis and in Asia Minor, perhaps the timid waters alluded to in the letter neighboring to the Laodiceans in Revelation 3 and verse 16. The larger establishments had large halls, smaller game or conversational rooms, gardens, swimming pools, dressing rooms, and other places. The atmosphere was somewhat that of a country club, combined with a community center. So here one came to meet with friends, converse, and have a snack of food and drink. Here one could read, exercise, get a massage, listen to the philosopher reports, as well as get a bath. Now, some baths had special hours reserved for women, and a few cities had women's baths. However, mixed bathing began sometimes in the 1st century AD, became widespread by the end of the century, so that double baths gave way to single set of facilities. Public nudity was not always a matter of concern. The baths were very popular, had an equalizing effect, and drew mixed moral judgment because they were sometimes associated with immorality. And some philosophers thought that they had a weakening effect on the body. A Latin inscription expressed one attitude. It says, baths, wine, and women corrupt our bodies, but they make life worth living. You see. So, and then they also would have that of what they would call banquets, okay? And the Bible points out reference to that of banquets, and we'll talk about that too. But Mr. Bale, he talks about the public baths were a fixture of every town in the empire, including Jerusalem. And they were, according to Oxford Classical Dictionary, they were the most important buildings of the Romans. Even the small towns, Pompeii and Herculaneum, had several to handle the demand. The town of Baiae on the Bay of Naples was simply an outgrowth of the warm baths there, as it was the town of Bath in England, and so forth. They had all of these different baths. They was just simply a center of that of the social life of the imperial time. People congregated there, as we said, by the early afternoon, exercising. initiating sexual liaisons and wrangling invitations for dinner and listening to gossip and observing who was with whom. Now, when I read that, and if you go over and read the book of Timothy and the book of Titus, and they're dealing with some of the issues of the day, the issues there in reference to what's going on in the church, a lot of those things are condemned. That idea there, they gathered together in reference to that of listening to gossip, going as we would say, they were going from house to house, as Paul tells Timothy, that you can't do that, and so on. And so you can see, if we were to run references in reference to that, some of those things, because people have been doing them, going to the baths, and therefore now they don't go to them, the other things also were part of their life also. And so they had to do away with those things. At the baths, which were more like our shopping malls than health clubs, one could hear a poet reading his works, get a shave, buy clothes, or just while away a few pleasant hours, they would say. The government recognized these places for diffusing the discontent of the masses, and they underwrote the cost. We don't want our legislature to read that, so don't y'all repeat that, because they'll be taxing us to have that in every city. Some baths in Rome are so large that surviving portions are used as churches and operated theaters. All over the empire, homes of the wealthy had their own baths, but it was expensive and time-consuming to heat the water for just a few people to bathe, so even the rich frequented the public baths. And so bathers would go into a dressing room with a shelf running around for their clothes. Theft was a frequent problem. Those who would do so usually brought a slave to watch their garments, and in the cold room, bathers sponged off. In the warm room, they accustomed themselves to warmer water before entering into the hot room, which was so hot that people sometimes fainted. A few deaths even were recorded. Warm air from the furnace, which heated the water, circulated through the ducts in the floors and the walls, so that the room was like a sauna. In the hot room, bathers soaked in a pool of water, coated themselves with olive oil, and scraped it off with a curved metal scraper called a sturgical. Sturgical. Okay, if they had the money and the time, they could enjoy a massage and even have unwanted body hair removed. Seneca once lived over a bathing establishment and complained about the screams of people having their hair pulled from their unarmed arms. And so I guess some things that's funny to me. Literature shows that the Christians needed to discern what was good and what was bad. Conduct at the baths. Now, that's what Paul deals with in some other passages. And so late in the 2nd century, Clement of Alexander criticized bathers who displayed wealth by using gold and silver vessels to sup and get drunk while bathing. And he warns against baths open to that being flirting and all that type of stuff to men and women, with accompanying list of licentious indulgence. Men bathing is to be for health only, women's for cleanliness and health. It is not necessary to bathe for the heat, and one should not bathe for pleasure, he says. Somewhat later, the Apostolic Constitution tells Christian women to avoid that disorderly practice of bathing with men. Any questions? So we talk about immodesty apparel, and the reason why we talk about immodesty apparel is because what the Bible says in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. Then we come on this question of hair. And I was telling someone as we talked about hair. Brother, I don't know if any of y'all ever knew Brother Guy in Woods. I remember in the 70s we were at pre-art lectures, and somebody asked Brother Woods about the length of a person's hair. And he says, well, I believe if it's longer than mine, it's too long. Brother Woods didn't have any hair. So everybody got a chuckle out of that, but the Bible deals with the hair. If you'll take 1 Corinthians chapter 11, if you want to turn over there, and we have people, that wear hats, and people who wear wigs, and people who lets their hair grow real long. Women, I'm talking about basically. But the Romans' attention to grooming began early in the morning. Women devoted great care to arranging their hair in the latest style. I can remember my mother taking my baby sister, and she would comb her hair at night. All my older sisters, they were the oldest two, and so they'd already left the house. I, could remember things like that. But my mother would comb her hair at night, brush it. And then in the morning, she would help her, she would brush her hair for school. And so the aristocratic women had slaves who specialized as hairdressers. Now, they often had their mistresses' ears because they spent so much time in their such close contact. So as we might suspect from Paul's references to hairstyles. Over in 1 Corinthians 11, beginning in verse 14, he says, doth not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him, but if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given her for a covering. So women normally wore their hair long. Now, Ovid describes his mistress' hair as coming almost to her knees. Apuleius, he talks about women's hair as the most important part of the body. Now, if you look at verse 15 there, he says in 1 Corinthians 11, if a woman have long hair, it is a glory to her. If I recall correctly, let me look right quick back. I've already closed this book. On page 228 in the book, if you look there, there's a Roman couple, and I know who the woman is, but I can see her curly hair and other things about her. When you look at the picture, she's pretty and he's ugly. Okay. That's the reason why you can tell they're different. But you notice the hair there. That's one of the things I noticed in reference to that was that of the hair of the woman, because it seemed like either it was cut off or it was pulled back to the back in that picture. But there have been a lot of discussions in reference to that, how long's long, how short is short. And so it concludes that a woman cannot be considered decently dressed unless the hair has her hair fixed in a becoming style. Now, reference in the Talmud indicate that this fashion was followed in Judea. Jewish women wore such elaborate hairstyles involving braids and hair pieces that it was forbidden to undo a woman's hairdo on the Sabbath because it involved transgression, the prohibition, watch this, of building and demolishing. And that's kind of funny. You can't undo her hair on the Sabbath. There are paintings and there are coins from the first century show that women's hairstyles changed every few years. Sometimes the hair was done up in a bun on the neck, and other times it was piled up on the top of the head. There are portrait busts of women are sometimes found to possess detachable marble wigs, which could be replaced as fashions altered. And some women supplemented their natural locks with wigs and hairpieces, usually taken from slaves or war captives. At several points during the first century, braids were fashionable, especially with jewelry fashioned unto them. But the Apostle Paul, if you'll turn over to 1 Timothy chapter 2, and verse 9, Paul there points out to them in verse 9, in like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel with shamefacedness and sobriety, not, he says, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly array. And also when Peter wrote in 1 Peter, even in chapter 3 and verse 3, he points out there, he says, whose adorn let it not be that of the outward adornment of the plaiting of the hair and the wearing of gold or of the putting on apparel. So they warn against women devoting too much attention to braiding and ornamenting their hair. One reason for considerable combing and brushing, however, they may have been the removal of that of headlights, because that was a problem. But yet there are those who actually, in reference to that of a woman, the Bible points out too that it's her covering and it's a glory to that of God. And some people, there are those in the church that, they wear a hat, and some of them wear a little dolly-like thing on the back of their hair. It has never caused a problem, as far as I know. I know they debated the issue, but it has never been something that people would withdraw fellowship from. We did have someone who identified with us at Cartersville some years ago. They left a few years later, but they were great people. We loved them both. And but he would not allow her to put braids and things of that sort in her hair because of 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 9. He didn't want her to braid her hair or put gold or pearl or in her hair. And they asked me about it, and I said, well, it was a custom back then, and these people were overdoing it. And they were just simply pointing out, people look at this silver and this gold. These people are very wealthy. In our day and time, somebody snatch your hair off. You have pearls and gold and silver in it. But he asked me, and I told him, I said, I don't see any problem in it. Well, they ended up getting a divorce, and my understanding is the first thing she did is had her hair plaited and everything else. But it is a discussion that does come up. And again, in 1 Corinthians 1, chapter 11 there, and in verse 14, and it has debated among our brethren in reference to that. How long is long? How short? Short. Should a woman cut her hair? Should she not? Should a man wear his hat? I don't know. I wear a hat and so forth. And I wear a hat every once in a while. I'm not a hat wearing person, but I do wear a military style hat. And when I do, and I pray, I pull my hat off. Now, even I've done funerals for military and I had on the military color guard outfit. And I was inside a church building, and I was going to be the speaker. And so I spoke with my hat on and so forth, but then I had a prayer, and I pulled my hat off. And I just, because of what he seems to me, that's the idea. 11:14, does not even nature teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a shame unto him, talking about a man and so forth. And he talks about a man there being covered and uncovered. If you go back, let's see, verse, I want to go all the way back. Verse 2. But I would have you to know that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of a woman is the man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. And so I pulled my head off. Okay, men's hair was short. I think if we were to take the time to see archaeology, maybe I would encourage you, if you have access, and you do have access because you're listening to me on a computer, that you go over and look up the Caesars, okay? And you'll see the length of the hair of the Caesars. And that's probably the length of the hair that our Lord had. That is suggested by people. So men wore their hair short, seldom over the ears or any longer in the back than is considered normal today. Paul's admonition that men wear short hair should be short suggests that this practice was commonplace among the Greeks and the Romans of that time. Only fops and deviants and did otherwise. Artistic evidence such as depictions of the Jews on the Ark of Titus shows that Eastern people wore their hair somewhat longer than the Romans and favored beards. And so a line in one of Marshall's epigrams urges a friend not to let your beard be that of Orientals, so meaning the Persians. So by the first century, however, the rabbi with their authority, permitted Jews who had frequent contacts with Romans to clip their beards, and some Jewish men appeared to have gone clean shaven. So the Talmud refers frequently to barbers and hairdressers who also sold cosmetics and gave manicures and pedicures and for minor medical services. And so most Roman men began their day with a visit to a barber, which would be painful experience. Could be a painful experience. In addition to shaving their face, some Roman men had their hair plucked from their underarms. So men of questionable character depleted their arms and legs as well. They didn't want any hair on any of their body. And women also shaved or plucked their underarms and legs, or used the creams that would take them away. And removal of body hair seemed to have been the fashion for women all over the civilized world. A common jib or jibe as at Bavarian women is their hairnets. Now, a bad hair day. There's in the book. It says, "I warn you to stop dyeing your hair." Now you don't have any hair that you can tend. You know you did this to yourself. You kept on applying that poisonous mess to your head. Now Germany will send you a captive's hair, and you'll be covered with a triumphant gift. Oh dear, she can't hold back the tears, and with her hands she brushes tears from her reddened cheeks. In her lap she holds what used to be her hair and gazes at it, a treasure that doesn't belong there. That's what Ovid said. Brown or black hair was the dominant color of people's hair, and in the New Testament times, but blondes were frequently, and again, if you look at the emperors, like the Emperors Augustus and Nero had blonde hair, according to Suetonius. Some women bought wigs made from the blonde hair of the Germans' captives, and Ovid's mistress tried to dye her hair blonde, and with unfortunate results. And that's what I just read, okay? Then they had cosmetics. In addition to all the attention they gave to their hair, the people of the New Testament times used cosmetics heavily. A pale complexion was considered desirable for women, and those who had darker skin achieved the effect by using white powder, often in such thick layers that they were afraid to go out if rain threatened. Even a tear could plow a furrow down one of Heavy's coated cheeks. Both Juneval and Marshall made such frequent comments about painted and powdered women that we might wonder if they looked more like Japanese geisha girls. And so the paintings of Pompeii helped correct that impression. Aside from eyeshadow, the women portrayed there do not appear to even be overly made up, though their skin is generally paler than the men's, a common convention of ancient art. Heavy use of white powder may have been merely an affection of the rich in that of the capital. And so Ovid, again, considered cosmetics with an important topic that he wrote a book on the art of beauty, which did not survive in its entirety. But in it, he gave the formula for making powders and ointments. In book 3 of The Art of Love, he gives a shorter version of some of the same advice, but urges his readers to apply the technique in the privacy of their rooms. A man wants to admire the effect, not learn how it was achieved. Put on the finishing touches privately, out of my sight. Why do I have to know the cause of your lovely complexion? He said. So Jewish women also use cosmetics heavily, but in part for genuine health reasons. Makeup applied around the eyes and mouth prevented those sensitive areas from drying out in the arid Judean climate, and many have helped cut down on that of infection, and so they would use those. Now, some of the things that we discussed in the lesson may probably shock people, but that was not the primary purpose. The author tried to show how drastically the Greco-Roman view of morality and personal behavior differed from the Christian conception. And that's the reason why we looked at passages. And so I hope that we have a better understanding of how the early Christians were up against as they presented their message, and how that opposition may have shaped their own views, and their view of how how they should live was indeed so different from that of the people around them that they could be called these people who have been turning the world upside down, Acts 17, verse 6. And so Christians were to be different. You know, there were these people who showed themselves for that of the world, but yet we would find that they were showing themselves in reference to being different. And so in being different, Christians were to be different. They were to shine forth as that of lights for Christ. They were to be godly people. They were not to dress like the people of that of the world. And that's what many people, and some of them, do the very same today. Any questions or comments? Speak, forever hold your peace.
We getting to the end of the book. What are we going to do after we get to the end of the book? We're going quite fast.
We're going to start back. Oh, no. We're going to cover some things in this in the other book that I have, Brother Ferguson's books and backgrounds.
Okay.
Because we've got, like I said, about 6 lessons, or six more times to meet. That's around 12 hours, and we only have 2 chapters left. Basically, the last chapter is not all that informational. But also, just this past week, I bought for my Logos program a number of things dealing with customs and culturals and things of that sort, and I'm going to try to use some of those. But Brother Ferguson, in his book, like I said, that book is 280-something pages, close to 300 pages, Mr. Bales is, and Brother Ferguson's book is, let me get rid of it's over 600 pages. So, and small print. I mean, I can read it from that standing 16 to 18 inches from it, but it's very, very small print. So we'll go in there and pick out some things to look at. What I'm going to do is try to look at some passages that we haven't covered and go back and look at the customs and things of that sort, and then see if you have any questions. If you have any of the questions about some of the things that are customs, and then we can discuss those. But I would like for you to tell me beforehand. You can email me if you like, and so forth. It's been interesting to me to realize, that how that to come to the conclusion that you have these 2 groups of people. Really, you have 3 groups: the Romans and the Greeks, and then you have the Jewish people. But among the Jewish people, you have those that were from Judea, Jerusalem and Judea, as we would say that one place. Then you had those who were scattered about, the diaspora, as we call them, the Hellenistic Jews, because they had taken some of the Greek influence in their own lives. And probably when they would leave their homes and come to the city of Jerusalem and see some of their families, that their families probably shocked with some of the things that they had picked up among that of the Greeks. And but yet when these people became Christians, and they had to give up a lot of things because they had those influence in reference to that of the Greek influence, but also they had the influence of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Herodians, and all those others among the Jews. And so just to stop and think about that, and when we start talking about different things, especially when we think about the Roman congregation, the Corinthian congregation, and so forth, that the different people there. And so therefore, when Paul addresses something of it, he addresses it from a standpoint that it's going to cover both what we would, let's just say Jew and Gentile. It's going to cover both what the Jew and the Gentile are doing that's not correct according to what God said. That's the reason why the Bible is so specific about certain things. Any other questions? I'll try to make kind of like an outline, for some things later. I have in the biblical archaeology class, I don't have but 3 more classes, because their classes are 2.5 hours, and we've had 800 pages to cover in 2 books, and last week we covered 150 to 200 of them. But basically in that study it was a lot repeated, and so now we're just going to do biblical archaeology of the New Testament. And I noticed that there had some things in there that dealt with the customs and so forth, and so I'll look at that, and if I come across some of that that's important, then we'll do that. Okay. I hope you got all the information you needed there, Lawrence, because the first part was not recorded. Anything? Because, let me say this. Something's happened to my, there it goes. Something happened to my mouse. I think the cat's chasing me. I guess Jim knew this. We had our second great-granddaughter this week.
Yep. Congratulations, Bobby.
We were 8 pounds and 1 ounce, 21 inches long. Their second great-grandchild. Y'all have a good night.
Big